This is actually half a class.
All right.
The other half you will have to do yourself. Because what I'm going to do today is I'm going to equip you to do the kind of work that we have been doing over the past 8 weeks. 9 weeks including this. 10 weeks chronologically, but anyway. I'm going to equip you to do the same kind of work that we've been doing. Can we make it cooler in here?
I can.
You're going to handle it too. By the way, I turned down the temperature in the church. It was sitting on 76.
Oh, good. I was hot in there too. I thought I was having flashes or something. I've been going through mental pause. Okay. Albert Schweitzer, in the early 20th century, wrote a book called The Quest of the Historical Jesus, in which he determined, that the quest of the historical Jesus is a daunting task at the easiest level, and so, and yet, and much of his scholarship has been superseded by more recent scholarship. But one of the things he did was he did a lot of work at looking at what Jesus said and how he said it and who said that he said it and comparing those and to try to determine what Jesus' mindset was. Now you'll remember at the very first of this course I mentioned that Jesus was an apocalypticist. And it was Albert Schweitzer who first came up with this notion, with this convincing argument of Jesus being an apocalypticist. He wasn't the only one. Obviously, it was a large movement and included St. Paul. So we're gonna look at some of the ways that we can take these texts and other sources and look at how we might determine more precisely what we think Jesus actually said and did, and how that might color, or not, our normal sitting in the pew view of weekly scripture. Okay. What we might want to do, let me turn this a little bit. It might be a goal of some people to look behind and beyond the scriptures in order to determine what Jesus actually did and how he appeared to and appealed to his followers. In order to do that, we might need to look at other sources of information that have to do with Jesus, other writings, contemporary writings, and that kind of thing. We might take a look at, specifically, we would take a look at 3 different sources. Pagan writings of about that time, Jewish writings of about that time, and Christian writing of the same time. Remember that the earliest writings in the New Testament were not the Gospels. The earliest writings were the epistles written by Paul. And so let's look at those things. Now we want to contain ourselves into writings that are contemporaneous with the New Testament. That, in other words, somewhere in the first 100 years after Jesus was crucified. So, how do we address sources critically to make a good determination? We're going to ask that later on. There were other Gospels, non-canonical Gospels, probably about 20 of them, that did not make it into the canon, some of which were considered for inclusion in the canon, but many of which were far later than the date when the canon was closed in 327. Some are narrative Gospels, like our canonical Gospels. In other words, they tell the stories about Jesus and his works, and some are sayings Gospels, like the Q document. Most of the information that we have from Q that ends up in Matthew and Luke are sayings. The Beatitudes, for example, and the Lord's Prayer, those kinds of things are part of sayings gospels. There is a gospel. There was a gospel of Peter, and I think I told you about it. That gospel is just wacko. It's just weird. It's very strange. It tells the story, you may remember that I briefly mentioned it, of the actual resurrection of Jesus, where two men show up at the two beings show up at the tomb and roll the stone away. The stone was very large. Two men probably could not have rolled it, but these two beings go into the tomb. They come back out of the tomb. Coming out of the tomb then are two beings whose heads reach to the heavens, it says, and they're holding up a third being whose head reaches above the heavens. And they come out and they are followed by a cross, which comes out as well. A voice comes from heaven that says, "Have you preached the good news to those who have fallen asleep?" And the cross answered, "I have." It's the only thing we have of what actually happened. We can't say it didn't happen, but anyway. Another of the Gospels, a narrative gospel, is the Gospel of Thomas. By the way, the Gospel of Peter is ancient. It is probably contemporaneous with the New Testament. The Gospel of Thomas also is ancient. By the way, these both were found at Qumran. They were part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Nag Hammadi documents, which were the documents were found at a place called Nag Hammadi in a particular earthen vase, included the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas was a sayings gospel. It consisted of 114 sayings of Jesus. The problem with the Gospel of Thomas is that it has much more to do. When I say contemporaneous, I mean approximately contemporaneous. As you know, right at
this place you mentioned, Nag Hammadi.
Nag Hammadi, that was a location at Qumran.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Within Qumran.
Yeah, they were digging for the shepherds were digging for fuel, so that they could cooking fuel. Well, what's the best cooking fuel where you herd sheep?
Animal poop.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so they were digging for deposits of animal poop. They used it that dried out, and they used that for cooking fuel. And that's what they were looking for.
I was going to, if I may interject here, on Discovery Channel, there's a show called Expeditions Unknown, and it's every week. The guy that does it, he's an archaeologist, and several of his past ones have been going over there to all these tunnels and everything where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and getting into some other archaeologists over there and going into areas that have never even been found before.
Oh, wow!
And he has several shows on that over there, and then also he did one on whether Jesus was born in Bethlehem or what was the other? Nazareth, and it was all the local stuff that compared.
Right.
So there's several. He has some very interesting shows. Now some of them are just diving in the water for a ship or something, but he has several on this, and on the Dead Sea Scroll. There's the metal, the copper Dead Sea Scroll that they found, which supposedly had told about where treasures were buried.
Thank you. The sayings of Thomas, the sayings of Jesus found in the Gospel of Thomas, have more in common with the 2nd century than with the 1st century, because you may know that right after the Gospels were written, there was the development of this new philosophy, which was called Gnosticism. Gnosticism from the word gnosis in Greek, which means knowledge. A Gnostic view has to do with our being made in the image of God, and each of us, and some of us, have this divine spark inside. And so the whole idea is to develop your own divine spark, and the way you do that is by gaining as much knowledge as you can about God and about the salvation that Jesus offers and all that kind of stuff. And by knowing these things, you can make yourself more available to go into heaven when you die.
That's kind of like the Mormon or LDS. They have a lot of Gnosticism in there.
There's a lot of Gnosticism in Mormonism. It's also Pelagian in its character. Pelagius was a theologian, early heretical theologian, who Pelagianism is sometimes called bootstrap theology. In other words, you can do and know the right things in order to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get you to heaven. And the only problem with that is that it's not orthodox. Orthodoxy says the only way you get to heaven is if God decides it. That's it. You can live your life. You live your life how you think you ought to, and God will decide. Pagan sources. Let's look at pagan sources. There are 2 mentions of Jesus in pagan sources, and one of them calls him Chrestus, and it was written by Pliny the Younger, who wrote to his uncle. Who wrote to the Emperor Trajan, and said that the Christians, Crestins, worshipped Crest. I guess not the toothpaste, because it hadn't been invented back then. And they were a pestiferous people. They were pesky. They did things that were weird. They wouldn't follow the laws and that kind of thing. And he was asking for advice. What do I do about them? And Trajan, I think, did answer him, and he said, if they're not hurting anybody except themselves, just leave them alone, because that's a tar baby. You don't want to get into that. And there was one other mention in it was very small. Now I can't remember what it is.
Also mentioned with Flavius Josephus.
Well, but Josephus is a Jew. I'm going to get to Josephus.
Oh, okay, sorry about that.
Yes. I'm going to get to Josephus. I can't remember who the other pagan author was. Silly me. Okay. Here are the Jewish sources. There are not very many of them either. You would think that since Jesus was a Jew, that the Jews might be interested in determining who this guy is and figuring out where he comes from. Josephus was a first century aristocrat. He was drafted as a general in the Jewish wars, and he was stationed in the Galilee, up in the northern, what had been before the northern kingdom. The area of the Galilee was quickly taken over by the Romans. And Josephus, the story of Josephus is kind of funny, because Josephus and his men, they were surrounded, and they decided to draw lots to see. They had a suicide pact, and they would draw lots to see who killed who got to kill it, and they would do this until there were only 2 people left. And those 2 people would take their own lives. So Josephus drew one of the last lots, and so he was. But when it came his time, he convinced the other guy to just surrender with him, and they did. Josephus was, as I said, he was an aristocrat. He's very highly educated, and he went to Rome then. Okay, he went to Rome. It's not on there. He went to Rome then and became the emperor at that time gave him a house to live in and money to live on if he would write history. And he wrote a 2-volume work called The Jewish Wars, in which he wrote about the Jewish wars. And then he wrote a 20-volume work called The Antiquities of the Jews, in which he traced the history of Judaism, beginning with, you guessed it, Adam and Eve. He began with Adam and Eve and went all the way to the present day. In the Antiquities, he mentions the person of Jesus and describes his death. He says that Jesus lived in Judea and that he did great deeds, that he had a following of a not insignificant following, and that he was crucified by the Romans under Pontius Pilate. So Josephus verifies to us that there really was a Jesus. I mean, he is an outside source and what we would call an independent source. He is independent of the gospel writers. He is independent of Paul and the other writers of the New Testament. Okay. The other non-canonical gospels, like Peter and Thomas, although they're there, the other non-canonical gospels are late and are not very reliable because they're late. Other writings about Jesus are very few and late and unreliable. Therefore, just about all the information about the person of Jesus comes from the New Testament. Now, you might think, if you haven't read the New Testament, you might think that there is a lot in the writings of the New Testament, other than the Gospels, about Jesus. There isn't. In fact, the most prolific writer about Jesus is Paul, and he writes enough information to put on a 3x5 card. He says he was born of a woman. I'm not sure what the option might be, but
I think he says that because in the Roman mythology, he's addressing that sometimes a god comes down and is not born of a woman.
Is not born of a woman, right. Well, never mind. He says he was born a Jew. He mentions that he taught. He mentions that he taught. In fact, Paul mentions two things that he taught. The first is that Christians should not divorce, and the second is that Christians should pay their preachers. I am down with that. And he says he was crucified, and he knows about the Last Supper. Paul knows about the Last Supper and what Jesus said at the Last Supper. In fact, many of the words of institution that we use are from Paul's writings, not from the gospel writings. But that's it from the other writings in the New Testament. So just about all we have reliable comes from the Bible that you have already read. You have already read almost everything there is ever written contemporaneously about Jesus. Now, oceans of ink have been shed in writing about Christianity and about Jesus and about theology and Christian theology and all that kind of stuff. But the descriptions of Jesus himself have to come from the biblical sources and very few others. The sources we have contain their own emphases and agendas, of course. So we've got to navigate our ways around those if we're going to continue to do this kind of work. Only by... Houston, we have a problem. Isn't that cute? Because even the ones that we have, we know to be reliable depending on how you look at it. Only by comparing the Gospels critically can we hope to look beyond them to see what Jesus may actually have been like. We will use three major criteria, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about these criteria. The criterion of independent attestation, the criterion of dissimilarity, and the criterion of contextual credibility. I'm going to unpack these. You don't have to write all that down. These are the ones that biblical scholars generally use. Okay, the first one is the criterion of independent attestation. And what it says is that multiple witnesses or it's sort of like in a court of law. The prosecutor wants to present many witnesses because each of the independent witnesses, not witnesses that are married to each other or brother and sister are going to be less reliable than people who don't even know each other saying the same thing. Multiple witnesses to the same thing make the thing that they say more reliable, especially if they are independent. So we have multiple sources for the life and teaching of Jesus. We have Mark, we have Q, which we find in Luke and Matthew. We also have M and L for the stories that are in Luke and Matthew that are not anywhere else. We have John, we have Paul, we have Josephus, and we have Thomas, as much as we can depend on Thomas. Traditions preserved in more than... These are all independent sources. Remember, Luke and Matthew are not independent sources because they both relied on Q. Traditions preserved in more than one independent source are more reliable than only one source. Here's an example. The Lord's Prayer. Matthew and Luke both have the Lord's Prayer, but it's not found anywhere else. It's not found in Mark or John. It's not found in Paul. It's not found in any of the other, even Thomas does not have the Lord's Prayer. Does this pass this criterion? No, because Mark and Luke are not independent. Now, remember, this criterion is only a way to determine that something is more reliable, not less reliable. Just because nobody says this but Mark and Luke doesn't mean that Jesus didn't give the Lord's Prayer. In fact, so many people remembered the Lord's Prayer that it's, in my opinion, this is uncritically though, in my opinion, Jesus probably did give the Lord's Prayer. Here's another example. Jesus associated with John the Baptist. That is attested in Mark, in John, and in Q. These are all independent sources that Jesus had some relationship with John the Baptist. Some people say John the Baptist was his cousin. Some people said John the Baptist was a prophet in the wilderness. Some say that John the Baptist was just out there and Jesus went and found him. But it doesn't matter. But there was the fact that there was an association is attested by three independent sources. The conclusion? Probably Jesus associated with John the Baptist at the beginning of his ministry. He couldn't have done so at the end of his ministry because John the Baptist had been dead for some time. Another example. Jesus is said to have brothers. Now this is attested in Mark, in John, in the writings of Paul, and in Josephus, Josephus in the Antiquities. So, and in Paul and in Josephus, Jesus is said to have brothers, one of whom is named James. So here are 4 independent sources. Remember, Paul didn't know the writers of the Gospels. Paul wrote largely before the Gospels. He also wrote contemporaneously with them. But he was writing before the Gospels. Paul did not know the Gospelers. So we have 4 independent sources saying that Jesus had brothers, and 2 independent sources saying that one of them was named James. Not this James. I'm not that old. Conclusion, Jesus probably had brothers, and one of them was named James. Another example. Jesus told stories that compare the kingdom of God to seeds. Jesus is found to tell these stories in Mark, in Luke, in Matthew, and in Thomas, in some of the sayings in the Gospel according to Thomas. Jesus probably told stories that compared the kingdom of God to seeds. You see what we're getting at here? Let's do one or more. This criterion is used to find stories which are more likely not to prove inauthenticity, as I said. Example, the Lord's Prayer found only in Q does not mean he didn't give it. The parable of the Good Samaritan is found only in Luke. That does not mean that Jesus did not give the parable of the Good Samaritan. But its reliability is less than, say, the parables about the kingdom of God being like seeds. because it is only found in one. Do you believe he said it? Yeah, I do. So, a lot of this depends on what you learn about Jesus and whether you think he could have said something like that. We're going to get to something where I'm not sure he could have said something like that. The criterion of dissimilarity. This is a criterion that says that a story or a saying is more reliable if it is dissimilar to the interests of the people reporting it. In other words, this is like a confession. A confession is fairly reliable because it is not in the best interests of the person who is giving it. Traditions ascribed to Jesus that do not advance the interests of the Christians pass this criterion of dissimilarity. We know that people made up stories about Jesus. We know that. We've seen examples of it in our study of the several Gospels, haven't we? We know that people made up stories about Jesus. We assume, knowing human nature, that they would not make up stories that did not advance what they were trying to advance. In other words, if I'm trying to advance Christianity to Wilson, I'm probably not going to tell Wilson that Jesus cheated at cards. It's well known that Jesus cheated at cards. I'm not going to say that because that does not engender a belief in Wilson in the thing that I believe in, that I'm trying to get him to believe in. People would probably not make up stories. Okay, example. We talked about John changing the day and time of the crucifixion of Jesus. Remember that? Remember when we talked about that? Nod your heads.
Yes.
Okay.
We'll wait. And his visualization on
That's right. Oh, yeah, the sine wave. Okay. He had a reason for doing that, but he changed that. This is dissimilar. And so it makes us wonder about the day and time, and thereby we know that John had a particular agenda because he changes the day and time of Jesus's crucifixion. Some examples. Jesus came from the village of Nazareth. Now, this is a multiply attested fact, but it doesn't sound very good if you say Jesus came from Nazareth. As a matter of fact, we're not the first ones to say that, are we? What did Nathaniel say?
What good can come from Nazareth?
Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Right. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Where's Nazareth? Nazareth is a one-horse town. It is even more remote than Bethlehem. Of course, Bethlehem was the city of David, so Bethlehem was not that remote, but it was remote. Nazareth was nowhere. Nazareth never appears in the Old Testament. The town never appears in the Old Testament. Nazareth does not even appear in the writings of Josephus. Josephus was the general in charge of the army in the Galilee, where Nazareth happens to be. And Josephus never mentions Nazareth. Conclusion? Jesus probably came from Nazareth. Now, that doesn't explain the difference between Luke and Matthew. Luke has Jesus being from Nazareth, Mary and Joseph being from Nazareth and traveling to Bethlehem. Remember the tax thing and that story. Matthew doesn't have the tax story. For Matthew, they lived in Bethlehem and they relocated to Nazareth because Archelaus, after the sojourn in Egypt, they found out that the ones who sought the child's life are dead, and so they went back. But as they were approaching, they found out that Archelaus was in charge in Bethlehem, and he was even worse than his father. And so they bypassed Jerusalem on the 610 and went and settled in Nazareth, which is where Jesus grew up.
Jerusalem, what you want to do if you're fleeing Herod.
Right. But this is a nowhere town. If you were making up a story about where Jesus came from, you'd say he was born at the feet of the temple, or maybe even in the temple precincts, or whatever. Conclusion, Jesus probably really was raised in Nazareth. Another example, Jesus is said to have been a carpenter. Actually, the Greek does not say carpenter. It calls Jesus a tekton. Now, tekton is a laborer, someone who works with his or her hands. And so this got translated, I guess, back in 1611 into carpenter, that Jesus was a carpenter. Now, we don't get any mileage out of Jesus being a carpenter. We can probably figure out or determine that Jesus did something before he became an itinerant preacher, but it's not a big deal to say, oh, he was a carpenter, so that means he could be the Messiah. I mean, it doesn't work that way. Now, a later tradition says that softened it a little bit, so we know there was a little bit of embarrassment about Jesus being a common laborer. There's a little bit of embarrassment about that because a later tradition says Joseph was a carpenter and Jesus was just his son. So, conclusion, Jesus probably worked with his hands before becoming a preacher. Jesus was baptized by John. Now, why would we make that up? We wouldn't make that up probably because in the time of Jesus, the superior person would baptize the inferior person. It was the teacher that would baptize the disciple. It was the leader who would baptize the follower. And yet Jesus goes to John to be baptized. Wait a minute. This might suppose that John is superior to Jesus in some ways. As a matter of fact, Matthew kind of juggles that a little bit. Remember, Matthew has Jesus say, or has John say, wait a minute, you come to me, I should be baptized by you. And Jesus says, no, let us do this in order to fulfill all righteousness. Well, okay, I'm not sure what all that means, fulfill all righteousness, but Matthew has at least alludes to the common notion that it should be the superior that does the baptizing. Yes, sir.
Where is the part about the one who comes after me? I'm not fit to untie his sandals.
That is in Q, and I think it's in John.
Okay.
It's in Q, and I believe it's in John. It is not in Mark. It said that Mark does not refer specifically to what Jesus says. John the Baptist says. The first person to speak in, John came saying, a voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. As it says in Isaiah, which is actually in Micah, but, Mark wasn't real smart, I guess. But then the first person to speak is Jesus, who says, repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, repent and believe the gospel. Okay. Also, John baptized for the forgiveness of sins. Why would Christians say that Jesus got baptized by John for the forgiveness of sins? Why would we say that? Conclusion, Jesus probably was baptized by John. Another example. Jesus was crucified as a criminal. This does not advance the notion of the messiahship of Jesus. Nobody in those days, as we have talked about earlier, nobody really expected a Messiah who would be crucified, who would be executed as a criminal. Everybody thought the Messiah was going to be some person of power coming in on a white horse with a lance in his hand, and who would hew down all the enemies of Israel. Nobody expected gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Crucifixion, moreover, was the worst form of execution. That's why those clever Romans devised it. It was the worst form of execution. You were crucified naked. None of those crucifixes that you see with Jesus with a loincloth on the cross are accurate. None of them. Because Jesus was crucified stark naked for everybody to see. That's why it was so humiliating. That was why it was so degrading and demeaning. The Messiah was to be a figure of grandeur and power. Conclusion, Jesus was crucified. So some of these stories are multiply attested and pass this criterion of dissimilarity. It only gives us a probability of the factual nature of the history, not any type of certainty. Again, it's used to argue for a tradition, not against a tradition. And that's all history is. I mean, in a scientific experiment, those of you who are scientists know this, in a scientific experiment, the reliability, the proving of a theory comes from replicating the experiment. Well, in history, you don't replicate. The experiment is done only one time. It's done with. And so all you can do now is determine the probability that what is reported is actually what happened. Okay? It's like when I say to Mason, I told you to come over to my house last night. And Mason says, no, you didn't. And I said, yes, don't you remember when we were together the other day at some place where we actually were together? I told you to come over to my house. And Mason says, no, you didn't. I say you did. He says you didn't. Who is right? Nobody actually knows what was said between me and Mason. We only have what I remember and what Mason remembers. You get what I'm talking about? Mason and I cannot go back in time and watch Jim and Mason have this conversation. We can't do that. And so we only, yes, I specifically told you blah, blah, blah. You never said that to me. No, I said it was blue. You said it was orange. All of those kinds of things, and you've all had those discussions with your partners. You've all had them. I didn't say 9 o'clock. I said 10 o'clock. No, you said 9 o'clock. Well, you should have put it on the calendar. Yes, Jim.
I was going to say, unless you texted it.
Oh, yeah, unless you texted it. Right, yeah. Right. Texts are never lost. But that's all the study of history is a determination of the probability of some fact. Okay, the third one is the criterion of contextual credibility, which says that traditions ascribed to Jesus, or in any kind of biblical critical work, traditions ascribed to Jesus cannot be relied upon if they cannot be situated credibly into what we know about first century Palestine. Jesus was a first century figure who lived in Palestine. We can't have Jesus going to McDonald's for a hamburger. You get the idea. If we cannot situate this thing credibly into what happened, then it cannot be relied upon. This is the criterion that is used to argue against the credibility of a story. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. One is in the 3rd chapter of John's Gospel with Jesus and Nicodemus. You remember the story. Nicodemus comes to Jesus and says, Rabbi, we know you are from God, because nobody could do these fabulous things who wasn't from God. Jesus turns to him and says rather incongruously, I tell you the truth. Unless you are born again, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay, says Nicodemus, what am I supposed to do? Crawl back into my mother's womb? Jesus says, I tell you the truth. If you are not renewed, if you are not baptized by water and the Spirit, a heavenly baptism, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. The whole story only advances on the misunderstanding of the word that Jesus uses. It is a Greek word, anothen. Anothen is a word that means again or over again. It also means from above. Nicodemus hears Jesus says, unless you are born anothen, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Nicodemus knows that all people are sinners. He knows that he can't crawl back into his mother's womb. So he's saying, wait a minute, doesn't God want us to go to heaven? I can't crawl back in my mother's womb. Jesus says, you misunderstand. Unless you are born with a heavenly renewal, a heavenly kind of turn of life. Now, John says baptism, but that's what he's getting at. Unless you have one that is of water, in other words, of this world, and of the Spirit of the other world, you cannot enter. You won't have an understanding. You cannot have an understanding of life in this world, how it leads to the other world, that will take you into heaven. The problem is, that's a Greek word. Jesus and Nicodemus would have been speaking Aramaic, not Greek. There is no evidence that Jesus spoke Greek. There is evidence that Jesus spoke Hebrew. He quoted liberally from the Old Testament, from the Psalms mostly, but he didn't speak Greek. And the word in Aramaic does not have a single ambiguous word for again and from above. In fact, those two are different words. Conclusion, this probably never took place. This conversation didn't happen. The conversation may have happened, and Jesus may have gone on to say, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, blah, 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 which is John 3:16, which you see on bumper stickers. You just see John 3:16. You don't see the quote. And you see it at football games.
Golf tournaments, too.
And golf tournaments, right. Right. So, what do you think about that? You have to determine what you think about that. Because it doesn't pass muster here. There is no pun on the word anothen in Aramaic. There is only a pun in Greek, or a misunderstanding, use of a different word. Okay? Oh, that was it. Okay. These three criteria, the criteria of independent attestation, the criterion of dissimilarity, and the criterion of contextual credibility, are three criteria with which you may approach the readings and the writings of ancient texts. It's the only thing you can do to figure out their reliability. You can do this. You can do this with philosophy, if you like. You can do this with histories. You can do this with all kinds of reading. It is important, though, to read the. I'm going to sit down. It is important, though, to read the Scriptures critically, because we know that the Scriptures contain at least ambiguous stories and sayings. We know that the Scriptures contain stories that were made up later. And our work to find an authenticity of Jesus may be related to the reading that we do. You've got to approach these things critically if you want to know the historicity of this work. Now, I have not said a single thing about faith or theology in these 9 weeks. I have not talked about that. This is not to say that just because John changed the day and time of Jesus' crucifixion, we ought to take it, rip it out of the Bible, and throw it away. I don't espouse that either. It is to say we must approach these things critically to determine how the things that the writers posit land on our thinking brain. God told Moses to cut off his foreskin, not cut out his brain. We are not to approach faith uncritically. We are not to approach faith without thinking. We can't do that because God made us thinking creatures. God made us, in some ways, brilliant creatures. And we are to do this kind of work to determine how God and how Jesus, in specific for Christians, fits into what we understand about salvation. The reason for that is the soul yearns for salvation. Despite what Richard Dawson says, the soul yearns for salvation. It doesn't matter that Madalyn Murray O'Hair said there is no God. The soul yearns for salvation. I think I've said enough.
Madalyn Murray O'Hair is